It happened on a Thursday morning that looked like any other. I had set out the blue teacups Harold liked best. I'd arranged the oatmeal cookies on the tray just so, wiped the dust from the edge of the sideboard. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and old pine wood. Steady, familiar, quiet. My husband had always believed that any serious conversation should happen with tea, even in the last months, when pain lived just beneath the skin of his smile. He'd ask for tea before anything else. Jonathan arrived exactly on time. That part didn't surprise me. He always was his father's son in that way. Efficient, structured, direct. Rachel followed behind, tapping something on her phone, murmuring to someone through her AirPods. I noticed she didn't look up to say hello, but I told myself not to take it personally. They had arranged for a meeting with the estate attorney today. The word inheritance hadn't been said aloud, but it floated between the walls like humidity. I thought we'd sit down, the three of us. Harold may have passed, but we were still a family, weren't we? But Jonathan didn't take a seat at the kitchen table. He walked straight to Harold's study and stood at the threshold like a bouncer. Then, with the kind of voice people use when they think you're fragile, he said, "This is between family, Mom. We'll let you know later." I blinked. I must have misheard him. He was already turning to close the door. Rachel slipped in past him, not even meeting my eyes. The attorney followed, briefcase in hand, nodding once without warmth. Then the door clicked shut, not slammed, just shut. Decided. I stood there holding the tray. The porcelain rattled faintly against the saucers. For a long moment, I didn't move. I could see my own reflection in the glass frame on the wall, an old family photo from Yellowstone, back when Jonathan still had braces and Harold was still growing into his beard. I remembered the day we took it. Harold had insisted we stop at that overlook, even though it was freezing. I'd stood between them, one arm around each shoulder. We looked like a family that couldn't be broken. But now, I was standing outside a closed door, and for the first time in 45 years, I realized that my son had stopped seeing me as someone inside the story. I turned around slowly, walked back into the kitchen, and placed the tray down. I sat. The chair groaned beneath me like it had aged 10 years in a day. I didn't cry. I just stared at the steam curling up from the teacups that no one had touched. My hand trembled a little as I reached for one, not because I was cold, but because something inside me had cracked. I didn't know it yet, but that moment would change everything. It wouldn't happen loudly. There would be no yelling, no slammed doors, no dramatic confrontations. It would happen exactly like this, quietly, politely, as if I had simply expired. But I hadn't, and they were about to find that out. That night, I didn't sleep in our bed. I hadn't since the funeral. Harold's pillow still lay untouched. His slippers remained under the nightstand, like he might walk in and need them again. Grief has a way of suspending time. It doesn't rush. It waits, like a heavy coat hanging by the door, daring you to reach for it again. But that evening, after the door closed on me, like I was an outsider in my own life, the silence didn't feel sacred anymore. It felt like an echo chamber, one that repeated only what I refused to hear for years. I walked through the house, the way one walks through a museum after closing, quietly, reverently, but with the weight of knowing that everything you see now belongs to the past. The living room was still the same. The couch Harold and I had saved up for in the 80s. The bookshelves we assembled with shaking hands and too many screws left over. The lace curtains I sewed myself when Jonathan was just a toddler. Everything held a memory, but none of it held me. I had once believed that a home, by virtue of being built together, would keep its shape even when one of us was gone. But now I saw how easily one person's absence could let others redraw the blueprint. And Jonathan had started redrawing things long before Harold passed. I just hadn't wanted to see it. There were signs, of course, little moments that seemed too minor to matter. A missed phone call on my birthday, a strained smile at Thanksgiving, followed by polite distance, Rachel correcting me at the dinner table. Actually, it's not our house anymore, Mom. It's the family asset now. I had laughed it off, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. Jonathan had started using phrases like liquidation strategy, legacy planning, maintenance burden. Not at work, at home, while talking about the garden Harold had planted himself, while looking at the sunroom where I kept my reading chair. I'd watched him tap away at spreadsheets over dessert, whisper with Rachel in the hallway when they thought I couldn't hear. I thought they were just being responsible, good children helping me face the future. But now I saw it wasn't care. It was calculation. And the truth is, Harold had seen it before I did. It was 6 months before he passed. He had gotten thinner, his voice fainter, but his eyes, still clear, still Harold. We were sitting at the kitchen table. I had just made tea. It was our ritual. He took my hand across the table and said, "Elaine, I need to talk to you about something serious." I thought it would be about pain medication, or maybe the hospice timeline. I squeezed his hand, waiting, but what he said next felt colder than the October wind outside. "I've updated the will." I stared at him. He looked back at me, calm but steady. "Jonathan's different now," he said. "Not bad, just strategic, detached. He talks to Rachel like this is all business." I tried to wave it off. "He's just under stress, Harold. You know how he gets." But Harold shook his head. "No, love, this isn't stress. This is a plan. And I need you to promise me something." I didn't want to promise, not because I didn't trust Harold, but because I didn't want to believe that my son, our only child, could ever see us as variables in a spreadsheet. He leaned closer, voice rough. "Promise me, Elaine, that if you start seeing it too, you won't back down. You'll be ready. You'll protect yourself." I nodded. But inside, I still hoped he was wrong. Now, sitting alone in the same kitchen, the same chair, I realized he wasn't. And he hadn't just seen the change. He had prepared for it. I reached for the drawer under the bookshelf in the hallway, the one he'd told me never to open unless something felt truly wrong. It was locked, but I knew where the key was. 2 weeks before he died, Harold had given it to me. Small, brass, warm from his hand. He had pressed it into my palm and whispered, "Only after I'm gone, only when you see who they really are." I hadn't understood it then, but I was starting to. The brass key was still where I'd left it, tucked inside an old leather coin purse I hadn't touched in years, hidden at the back of my lingerie drawer behind the faded scarves and Harold's cufflinks I couldn't bring myself to throw away. I held it in my hand for a long moment, small, unremarkable, slightly tarnished. But the weight of it felt heavier than gold. I remembered Harold's eyes when he gave it to me. He was already fading then, breath shallow, words fewer. But this key, he had pressed it into my palm with more strength than I thought he still had. "You'll know when it's time," he had whispered. "Don't wait for anyone to tell you." And now, standing there in my bedroom, the door to his study still closed behind Jonathan's voice from the day before, I realized it was time. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with a blanket around my shoulders and the brass key resting in the center of a clean napkin, like an artifact. Outside, the neighborhood lights went out one by one. The silence inside the house deepened, not frightening, but aware, like the walls themselves were waiting to see what I would do. At sunrise, I dressed, not for anyone, not to look nice, just for clarity. The old gray wool coat Harold liked on me, the one with the loose button I never sewed back on. I tied my hair up neatly, took one look in the mirror, and nodded to no one. The bank was a 10-minute drive. Valley Trust, just off the highway, quiet, small, unassuming. Harold never liked big institutions. Too many people touching your money, he used to say. The manager recognized me the moment I walked in. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, rising from behind his desk, as if he had been expecting me for months. Mr. Mercer left very clear instructions. "Follow me, please." We walked down a narrow hallway lined with framed landscape prints. The carpeting muffled our footsteps, which somehow made my heart beat louder. At the end, he stopped in front of a small room with a metal table and a safety deposit box already set beside it. "I'll give you privacy," he said gently. When he left, I slipped the brass key into the lock. It turned without resistance. Inside was a folder, a flash drive, and a single cream-colored envelope with my name written in Harold's unmistakable hand. I sat down. My hands shook as I opened the envelope first. The letter was short, only a few lines, but each word felt like it had been carved, not written. "Elaine, if you're reading this, it means what I feared has come to pass, but you are not alone. Everything you need is here. Read it, watch it, and remember, you are the heart of this family, no matter how they try to forget it. Love, Harold." I let the letter rest on the table and reached for the folder. Inside, a notarized copy of an updated will, signed and witnessed 6 months before his death. Everything was left to me. The house, the pension, the stocks and savings. Jonathan was mentioned only once, and even then with conditions. My breath caught. I knew Harold had updated the will, but I didn't know he had gone this far. I didn't know he had seen the same things I had and written them into law. Next was the USB drive. I didn't plug it in. Not yet. That would come later. But I held it in my palm the way I'd held Jonathan's hand the day he took his first steps across this kitchen floor. Back then, I had cried from joy, from fear, from the sheer weight of motherhood. Now I held something else, something Harold had prepared for me with the last of his clarity. And though my hands were older now and more uncertain, they were steady. I walked out of the bank into the morning light with the folder clutched to my chest, not like a weapon, but like a truth no one else had bothered to carry. When I got home, the house felt colder, not hostile, just waiting. I didn't answer when the phone rang that evening. I didn't even look at the screen. Instead, I sat at Harold's old desk in the study, the folder laid gently beside me, the flash drive resting on the mouse pad, and I whispered to the empty room, "I see it now, Harold. I see them." Then I turned off the light. The next morning, Jonathan arrived with a smile. Not the kind he used to wear when he'd come home from college, arms open, eyes searching for his father's laugh, or my cinnamon rolls. This one was tighter, practiced, a version of kindness rehearsed for meetings and negotiations. In one hand, he held a paper bag. "I brought croissants," he said lightly, "from that place you like." I thanked him, even though the bag felt too light. He'd forgotten I preferred the ones with almond filling. He never remembered that part. Rachel didn't come in. She lingered by the hallway, scrolling on her phone, not looking up. I noticed how she didn't call me Mom. Not anymore. Jonathan made small talk, weather, traffic, something about rising property taxes and the housing market. His tone was easy, but something else floated beneath it, urgency. A quiet hurry masked as casual concern. I nodded politely, offered coffee, and let him talk. But I was listening differently now. I noticed how his eyes flicked toward the hallway, toward Rachel, how he paused mid-sentence when she looked his way, how they both fell silent when I mentioned Harold's favorite chair needing reupholstering. They weren't just visiting, they were waiting for something. By mid-afternoon, the phone rang again. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again and again, different numbers. Then silence. It was as if something was supposed to happen, but hadn't. That evening, I opened the manila folder from the bank again. The updated will lay at the top, crisp and final, but beneath it was another folder, thinner, leather-bound, marked in Harold's tidy handwriting, Power of Attorney. Financial docs. I hadn't noticed it earlier. Inside were copies of signatures, letters from financial institutions, printouts of account movements, authorizations I didn't remember signing, credit applications, loan requests, a home equity line of credit, all in my name, but not my hand. The signatures weren't identical to mine, but they were close, too close. The loop of the E tilted the wrong way. The tail on the M flattened instead of rising. Someone had traced me, practiced me. My stomach sank. I sat very still, listening to the house breathe, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the refrigerator hum, the whisper of wind through the window panes, familiar sounds. But now they seemed like a soundtrack to a life I no longer owned. They were trying to sell the house, not someday, not when I was ready, now. And they were doing it quietly, without my knowledge, without my consent, with my forged name. That evening, I didn't cry, I didn't shout, I didn't call Jonathan. I walked into Harold's study. The room still smelled like his aftershave and the faintest touch of cedar. His lamp sat untouched, brass pull chain, always a little stiff. I turned it on, the light casting a warm circle over the desk. I sat in his chair, folded my hands, and waited for the quiet to settle. And then I opened the drawer. The old notebook was still there, our household ledger filled with decades of expenses, tiny inked entries, groceries, repairs, gifts, Harold's birthday dinners, Jonathan's school fees. Flipping through it was like walking through the seasons of a marriage. Tucked between two pages, just behind an entry marked Jonathan's first business loan, $18,000, was a note in Harold's handwriting. Pencil, faint but deliberate. If they forget who you are, remind them. I stared at it for a long time. Not because I didn't believe him, but because a part of me still didn't want to believe Jonathan had become someone who needed reminding. And yet, I knew now. He had drawn a line around what he considered family, and I had been placed outside it. That night, I sat in bed with the folder beside me. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't call a friend. I just listened, to the floor creaking under old wood, to the branches scratching gently against the window, to the hum of the house I had made into a home. They had tried to turn it into a transaction, but it wasn't theirs to sell, and I wasn't theirs to erase. It happened on a Thursday, late morning, just after I had finished folding laundry and taken the last of Harold's winter sweaters out of the hall closet. I remember the light in the kitchen. It was softer that day, a little golden, the kind that made the dust in the air shimmer. I had just poured myself a cup of tea when the doorbell rang. 2 chimes, then silence. I opened the door without thinking, expecting maybe a neighbor, a delivery, something simple, explainable. But standing on my porch were 2 strangers, a man in a crisp blue blazer and a woman holding a leather-bound clipboard. She had the kind of practiced cheerfulness I'd seen too many times at open houses and community fundraisers. Her smile was bright but hollow. "Good morning," she chirped. "We're here for the showing. The agent said we could stop by a little early." I stared at her. "The showing?" She looked at me, puzzled, then turned to her partner, who pulled out his phone and turned the screen toward me. It was a listing, my house, my address, Photographs, ones I didn't take. Pictures of my living room, the kitchen, even my bedroom. All clean, professionally lit, framed to emphasize space and light. 134 Oak Ridge Lane, he said, tapping the screen. Jonathan Mercer confirmed the time slot. I didn't hear the rest of what he said. The blood in my ears drowned it out. It was like the floor had shifted beneath me. I nodded vaguely. I think there's been a mistake. I closed the door gently, not out of politeness, but because if I'd let it swing shut, I might have collapsed with it. I walked back to the kitchen. The kettle had finished boiling. I turned it off, filled my cup, and sat at the table like I did every morning. I watched the steam rise and curl. My hands were steady now, but only because the shock had frozen everything else. They were selling my house, not planning to, not discussing it, selling, and I hadn't been told. I hadn't even been asked. There's a moment in every mother's life, I believe this now, when she realizes her child no longer sees her as someone to protect or even respect, just someone to manage, a detail to resolve, a complication to remove. That was my moment. And it arrived not in a shout, not in an argument, but in two polite strangers holding a clipboard and an open door to my future without me. Later that afternoon, I did something I hadn't planned. I pulled out my laptop, the one I rarely used, and searched for the listing myself. There it was. Charming, well-maintained property on a large corner lot. Ideal for renovation or investment. Owner prepared to vacate pending sale. Owner. Singular, not Elaine Mercer, not Mrs. Mercer, just a placeholder. A note in a file, a quiet afterthought in someone else's transaction. I scrolled down to the bottom, under the listed by section. Jonathan Mercer, my son, executor, contact point. No mention of me, no room for me. Just a closing date, already penciled in. My tea had gone cold by then. I closed the laptop and sat still. I thought of the birthday parties held in that living room, of the card tables we pulled out every Thanksgiving, of the hallway where I had waited nervously while Harold proposed with his mother's ring. They weren't selling a house. They were trying to erase a life. I could feel it now, tangible, sharp, not paranoia, not grief, not even betrayal. It was disappearance, planned, packaged, profitable. But they had underestimated something. You can't quietly move a woman who still remembers every nail in the floorboards, every crack in the tiles, every light switch Harold rewired himself with trembling hands. This wasn't just my home, it was ours. And even though he was gone, Harold hadn't left me alone. That night, the hallway felt longer than usual. The pictures lining the walls, birthdays, graduations, Christmases with snow outside the window, looked back at me with a kind of dull quiet. I paused at one in particular. Jonathan, at 7, arms raised in victory at his first soccer game, Harold behind him clapping, proud, beaming. I stood there a while, staring, trying to reconcile that boy with the name at the bottom of the real estate listing, Jonathan Mercer, sole contact. I returned to the study. The brass lamp clicked on with its usual reluctance. I sat in Harold's chair again. It no longer felt like a shrine. It felt like headquarters. The manila folder was still there. The documents from the bank, the forged financial forms, the will. But I wasn't looking for legal proof that night. I was looking for Harold. In the bottom drawer, beneath a bundle of letters and expired warranties, I found it. The old household ledger, the one we used for decades, a tan cloth cover worn thin at the edges, the binding loose. It still smelled faintly of pencil lead and time. We used to sit side by side with this ledger every Sunday night, marking down grocery receipts, vet bills, loan payments, savings goals, not because we had to, but because it made us feel steady, intentional, like we were building something real. I opened it to the middle. There were pages of neat handwriting, mine in blue ink, Harold's in black, row after row of ordinary life. The month Jonathan graduated, the car repair in '96, the furnace replacement that nearly broke our budget but kept us warm that brutal winter. Then I saw it. Tucked between 2 pages was a slip of paper, not filed, just folded and pressed flat, like a leaf between the pages of a forgotten book, written in Harold's handwriting, pencil, uneven pressure. A message not meant for lawyers or courts, but for me. If they forget who you are, remind them. The pencil had smudged slightly, but the words were still legible. My breath caught. Not from pain this time, but recognition. This wasn't just a warning. It was permission. Harold had seen it coming. Not the exact moment, not the doorbell or the clipboard or the listing, but the shape of it. The slow redefinition of what family meant to Jonathan and Rachel. The way affection had turned into asset management. The way I had stopped being his mother and started being a variable to solve for. He knew. That was what struck me most. Harold had known, and instead of trying to protect me with confrontation or conflict, he gave me something stronger, information, preparedness, a quiet kind of armor. I closed the ledger and sat still. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I thought I would be furious, betrayed, indignant. But what I felt instead was deeper, heavier, a long, low ache, like the kind you get in your bones before a storm. They thought I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't fight, that I didn't know how, but they had forgotten who raised Jonathan, who taught him to balance a checkbook at age 12, who proofread his business plan in the middle of the night while Harold made tea. I wasn't a relic. I was the reason the foundation held, and I still had the blueprints. I placed the note in the folder beside the will. Then I reached for the flash drive. I hadn't watched the video yet, not because I was afraid, but because a part of me wanted to believe there was still time, that maybe Jonathan would come to his senses, that maybe I was being too cautious, too cynical. But after what I saw on that listing site, after 2 strangers arrived on my porch asking to tour the house I had cleaned with my own hands, I knew I had waited long enough. I turned on the computer, slid the drive into the port, and opened the file marked, "For Elaine, Final." And there he was, Harold, thinner, paler, but still him. His eyes met mine through the screen. "Sunshine," he said, and I couldn't stop the tears then. "If you're watching this, then you've seen the truth." The video wasn't long, less than 10 minutes, but it changed the weight of everything I touched after. Harold sat at his desk, the light behind him soft, his face thinner than I remembered, but his voice still carried the same steadiness that had always steadied me. He spoke slowly, deliberately, like every word had to matter, because he knew there wouldn't be time for second chances. He told me he had noticed things, movements in the joint accounts, money transferred at odd hours. He overheard Jonathan and Rachel talking in quiet voices about repositioning assets, and the phrase that made his voice crack, "We'll move her when she starts forgetting things. It'll be easier for everyone." Harold paused after that. I could see the effort it took him to stay calm. "They're not protecting you," he said. "They're removing you, gently, legally, completely." When the video ended, the screen dimmed, and I just sat there in the study, not blinking, not moving. The house didn't feel like it was collapsing. It felt like it had finally gone still enough for the truth to settle. I wasn't being overdramatic. I wasn't misreading the tone of Rachel's voice or Jonathan's carefully chosen words. I was being erased, and they weren't doing it with cruelty. They were doing it with paperwork. The next day, the silence between us shifted, not louder, sharper. Rachel stopped calling me Mom. That word, short, simple, had once filled me with warmth every time it left her lips. It meant I was part of their circle, trusted, respected, even loved. But now she spoke to me like I was an administrative obligation. Elaine, the gardener left the gate open. Elaine, the tax statement came again. Not Mom, how are you? Not can I make you some tea? Just Elaine. It shouldn't have stung, but it did. Even Jonathan had started speaking to me in a tone that didn't leave room for answers, only agreement. Property taxes are going up, he said over lunch. This place is too big for you to manage. It's not sustainable. Each sentence sounded helpful, but each one was a verdict. You don't belong here. I nodded along, but inside I was listening to the rhythm of their removal. Every word calculated, every sentence delivered with polite detachment, as if I was already somewhere else. A few days later, the mailbox offered confirmation. A white envelope with bold lettering I didn't recognize. Inside, a notice of non-payment from a loan office I had never heard of. My name, my address. A personal line of credit in default. I held it in both hands. The edges shook slightly, but not from age, from clarity. They had taken out credit, in my name. I walked to the study, opened the folder Harold left me, and laid the notice beside the forged signature forms. The loops matched. The slope of the R, the tail of the E, almost mine, but not mine. They were borrowing money against my house, against my name, and doing it with a version of me they had quietly manufactured on paper, one who agreed, who authorized, who signed, without ever saying a word. I sat in Harold's chair again. This time, I didn't cry. I turned on the lamp. The brass pull chain clicked into place like always. I opened the old ledger, flipped past the rows of careful budgeting, and found the note again. If they forget who you are, remind them. I stared at it, no longer as a keepsake, but as an instruction. I looked around the study, at the bookshelf Harold had built, the worn leather chair he loved, the garden visible through the window. And for the first time in weeks, I said aloud, "They've already decided I'm gone." But I wasn't, and I would not sign myself out quietly. The next morning, I checked the mailbox before the sun had fully risen. It had become a habit by then. Less about anticipation, more about vigilance. I no longer expected cards or catalogs. I expected threats in envelopes printed on company letterhead, and I was rarely disappointed. That morning, another letter waited for me. This one wasn't from the same loan office. A new name, a new balance, a new interest rate applied to a credit line I had never opened. I stood there at the gate, the metal cool in my hand, envelope clenched tight, and I felt something inside me click into alignment. Not fear, not fury, just confirmation. They weren't just planning to move me. They were financing their future with my past. I returned to the study, opened the folder Harold had prepared, and began to build the case. The forged documents were there, clean, typed, signed with a hand trying too hard to match mine. The curves familiar, but shallow. The confidence of real memory missing from every stroke. I laid the loan notice beside them, then another, and another. A pattern emerged. All within the last 6 months, all filed under the premise of financial streamlining, all signed by Elaine Mercer, but not the one sitting here, awake before dawn, holding evidence of her own erasure. I pulled out the small brown folder labeled Legal Notes. Clark, Harold's handwriting again. Tight, deliberate letters, like he had written it through gritted teeth. If anything happens, trust Clark. He knows. He's seen enough. Call no one else. The name sounded familiar. Samuel Clark. He was at our wedding. Just a junior associate then, barely older than Jonathan is now. Harold had always spoken highly of him. Sam doesn't panic. He prepares. I picked up the phone. It rang only once. Then a warm voice answered, calm and steady, like he had expected me. Elaine. He said my name the way people do when they know you. Not just the version you show, but the one you try to protect. I was wondering when you'd call. My throat caught. You knew? I didn't know the timing, he said gently. But Harold left me instructions, files, statements. He told me not to reach out until you did. I didn't ask what Harold had given him. I didn't ask how long he'd been holding on to it. Instead, I said, I have letters, forged documents. They've been signing my name. A pause, then. I believe you. That was all I needed. Samuel asked to meet the next morning, quietly. No rush, no drama, just preparation. That night I slept. Not deeply, but differently. Not with dread, but with direction. I woke early and opened Harold's closet for the first time in months. His blue wool coat still hung there, the one he wore to every important meeting, every funeral, every bad news appointment where dignity had to be worn like armor. I didn't put it on, but I ran my fingers along the sleeve. Then I chose my own coat, the dark navy one with the pearl buttons, the one I hadn't worn since Harold's last hospital stay. Before I left the house, I looked around once more, the chair by the window, the tulip bulbs starting to peek through the garden bed, the teacup waiting beside the sink. It was all still mine. They hadn't taken it yet, but they had tried, and they didn't know how ready I now was. I invited them for Sunday afternoon, the kind of time slot that sounded harmless, familiar, civil. I phrased the message simply, let's sit down and talk everything through, just us. I could almost hear the satisfaction in Rachel's reply, like they'd finally worn me down. She's come around, I imagined her saying. She's accepted reality. Let them think that. That morning, I brewed coffee the way Harold liked it. Dark, 1 spoon of sugar, no cream. I laid out 3 mugs, arranged the napkins, set the table in the dining room where we'd once hosted every Easter dinner for 20 years. I wore the navy blouse with pearl buttons. I combed my hair, put on a soft lipstick. Nothing flashy, just the version of me they had already edited out. I packed the folder, blue leather, zipper closed. Every page inside had been reviewed by Samuel Clark. Every line had a purpose. Every signature, mine and Harold's, was real. When they arrived, it was like watching a dress rehearsal. Rachel breezed in with her tablet. Jonathan offered his usual shoulder pat. They spoke with the polished tone of people who believed they were about to solve a problem they had already priced out. Mom, this won't take long, Jonathan said. We've already mapped out a plan. We just want to make sure you feel included. Rachel added, unfolding a color-coded spreadsheet. Included. As if I'd missed a meeting, not a lifetime. The table was already filled with their documents, projections, transition dates, a brochure for a private care community with phrases like sunlight therapy and on-site pharmacy access. They were preparing to relocate me like a file from one folder to another. Jonathan leaned forward. We've pre-qualified you for a unit. It's really lovely. 2nd floor, overlooks a rose garden. You'll love it. I looked at the page he slid across the table, a photo of a beige building with cheerful landscaping and identical doors. I didn't touch it. Instead, I reached into my bag, unzipped the folder, and laid it gently over their paperwork. Jonathan paused. Rachel looked up. What's that? He asked, his voice still light, but his eyes tightening. Something you forgot to include in your plan, I said. I opened the folder, slid a single document across the table. Harold's final will, notarized, signed 6 months before his death. Jonathan frowned. We've already reviewed the estate paperwork. No, I said. You reviewed the version you thought was final. He reached for the paper, eyes scanning quickly. Rachel leaned in, Her face lost its color. "Everything to you?" she whispered. I nodded. "Everything." The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. No one moved. The house seemed to hold its breath. Jonathan laughed once, short, sharp. "That can't be right. Dad would have told me." "He did," I said. "He told me." Rachel reached for the folder. "We'll contest this." "You can try," I replied evenly. "But I have the medical evaluations proving Harold was of sound mind. I have the video testimony, and I have copies of the forged loan applications with your handwriting beside mine." I slid the next sheet forward, then another, bank statements, loan notices, signature analysis, their names, my name, falsified. Rachel didn't speak. Jonathan's hand clenched, his voice dropped. "You think you can manage all this alone? You're 74. "I'm not alone," I said softly. "I have a lawyer, I have a record, and now I have peace of mind." Rachel's tone turned brittle. "You can't keep that house forever." "Maybe not," I said, "but if I ever leave, it'll be because I decided to, not because someone tried to make me disappear in it." They didn't storm out. They simply gathered their things, papers they could no longer use, smiles they could no longer wear. Jonathan walked out first, quiet. Rachel followed, a half glance over her shoulder that held something between rage and recognition. I didn't move until the door shut, not slammed, just shut. I sat there for a while, letting the stillness settle. Then I reached for my coffee. It had gone cold, but it tasted like resolve. The next morning, I changed the locks, not because I was afraid they would come back, but because I needed that small, quiet gesture. For myself, for the part of me that had stood too long by open doors, waiting for permission to matter again. I called the utility companies, transferred everything back to my name. Not the estate of Harold Mercer, not Jonathan Mercer, executor. Just me, Elaine Mercer. I spent the rest of the week cleaning closets, not to erase anything, but to make space. Space for what I hadn't yet decided. I shredded old documents, packed up duplicate cutlery, took down the photographs of Jonathan from the hallway, not out of bitterness, just to breathe. I kept one. A picture of him at 5, frosting on his cheeks, laughing at something Harold had said during a backyard birthday. I placed it in a drawer, a reminder, not a relic. People change, and if they return, they'll have to meet me where I am now. Tuesday came, and I walked to the community center for the first time in months. I joined the watercolor class I used to skip when Harold got sick. I sat in the back with a woman named Marie who wore earrings shaped like oranges and told stories about her parrot who cursed in Spanish. We painted quietly, then laughed loudly. And it felt good, like air was moving again. I walked home slowly that afternoon, hands stained with blue and green. The garden was beginning to bloom. Tulips along the fence line, red and gold. Harold's favorite. I stopped by the raised beds and whispered, "You'd be proud of how I handled it." And I think he would be. Jonathan didn't call, not right away. But weeks later, an envelope arrived. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting. Inside, a card. No excuses, just one sentence. "If you're willing, I'd like to talk." I held it in my hand for a long time, then folded it, tucked it into my journal. I whispered, "Maybe, but not on your terms." 6 months have passed since the day I placed the folder on the dining room table. The house feels different now, not because I redecorated or changed the colors, because I stopped waiting for permission to stay. I moved the dining table closer to the window. The morning light hits it best there. I turned Harold's study into a writing room. The guest bedroom, once reserved for visits that always came with agendas, now holds fabric swatches, open books, and a sewing machine I forgot I loved. The silence? It no longer feels like absence. It feels like peace. I still keep a photo of Harold on my nightstand. He's smiling in it, wearing the wrinkled flannel he refused to throw out. Some nights I speak to him. Quiet updates, little victories. The tulips came up early this year. I fixed the back gate myself. I'm okay. One Sunday, Robert stopped by, Harold's oldest friend, the man who once stood beside him in matching tuxedos as our best man. Now he brings croissants without asking and never overstays. "You've made this place feel new again," he said, setting the bag on the counter. I smiled. "It still creaks in all the same places." He nodded toward the window. "Harold would have been proud of you." I didn't answer right away. My eyes stung a little, but I believed him, and that was enough. That spring, I planted tomatoes, built the raised beds with Robert's help. We painted the edges robin's egg blue, a color Harold once said reminded him of summer skies. Neighbors pass by and ask what I'm growing. I give them basil, marigolds, sometimes a smile. Not everyone knows what happened. Not everyone needs to, because this was never about revenge. It was about returning to myself on my own terms. One Tuesday afternoon, the phone rang. I knew the number before I picked up. Jonathan. "Hi, Mom," he said, voice smaller than I remembered. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything. I know I don't deserve—" I stopped him gently. "I'm glad you're getting help." He exhaled, shaky. "Would it be okay if I called again sometime?" I paused, then said, "Yes, but not to talk about the past, only the present. If you want to know me now, you start here." He agreed quietly. We hung up, and I stood at the kitchen sink, watching the breeze pass through the tulips. It's never too late, but it has to be real, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm still here, and I was never alone. The first thing I did after they left was make tea, not as a ritual, not to calm myself, just because I could. The kettle still let out its usual hiss. The cup still held its warmth in the curve of my palm, and the house, though quiet, felt steadier now, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. I walked from room to room, not to check but to claim. This was mine. Not because a folder said so, not because the law now stood behind me, but because every window, every cabinet, every crooked floorboard held pieces of me no one else had the right to sell. The next morning, I opened the front door just after sunrise. The air had that late winter chill that stings your lungs a little before warming. I stepped barefoot onto the porch for a moment, just enough to feel the wooden boards creak under me, to hear the garden stretch in silence. I watched the light move through the hallway, brushing the photo frames with a kind of quiet forgiveness. And then I started. I moved the dining table a few feet toward the window, where the morning sun poured in best. I opened all the curtains. I let the light hit things that had gathered too much shadow. The room Harold once called his study. I emptied it, removed the boxes, sorted through old tax forms, donation receipts, warranty manuals from appliances we no longer owned, not in anger, just release. Then I took the desk and moved it to face the window, stacked it with blank journals, and laid down the first page. Not for court, not for Jonathan, for me. The next day, I cleared the guest bedroom. It had always been reserved for visits that came with schedules and intentions. I folded the spare towels, returned the unused crib blankets to storage, and replaced them with bolts of fabric, thread, and a sewing machine I hadn't touched in 20 years. It became a place where my hands could make again. Stitch, mend, build. No one asked if I needed that room. That's why it mattered that I claimed it. Later that week, I stood in the hallway with a box in my hands. The family photos, some framed, some curled at the edges, others long faded under glass. I took down each picture of Jonathan slowly, not as punishment, not even with bitterness, but to make room for the garden I was about to plant, for the tomatoes I'd been meaning to grow again since Harold passed, for the version of myself that didn't require a place at anyone's table to matter. I kept one photo. Jonathan, age 5, covered in frosting, laughing, caught mid-breath. It was taken on the back porch. Harold had just said something ridiculous, and I'd clicked the camera too soon. The picture was blurry, but the joy, clear as anything. I placed it in the drawer of my new desk, not to mourn, but to remember what still might return, if it ever does. And if it doesn't, that's all right too, because not everything lost needs to be restored. Some things, once removed, make space for something steadier, like sunlight through a clean window, like coffee in your own cup, like silence that doesn't ache, just breathes. It came quietly, no ceremony, no apology wrapped in flowers, just an envelope in the mail. The handwriting was familiar, long strokes, a slight rightward tilt, like someone trying to seem composed. Inside, a card, plain, one sentence in blue ink. If you're willing, I'd like to talk. No signature. But I knew it was Jonathan. I read it once, then again, then folded it shut and placed it in the drawer next to Harold's old watch. Not to forget, not to reply right away, just to let it exist, like a rock on still water, there, but not needing to ripple yet. A few days later, the phone rang, unknown number, but my hand knew it before my mind did. "Hi, Mom." His voice had changed, lower, slower, like it had gone through something cold and come back careful. "I just wanted to say, I know I don't deserve it, but I hope someday we can—" I let him speak. I let the words fall, unsure and unfinished. Then, when he paused, I said, "If you want to know me again, you start here." A long silence, and then, "Okay." That was it. Not a reunion, not forgiveness, just permission to begin from now. And that was enough. That afternoon, I took the old garden shears and trimmed the tulips by the fence. Their petals had started to fade around the edges. Early spring always came too fast for them, but I clipped them gently, brought them inside, arranged them in the chipped ceramic vase Harold had made in a pottery class decades ago. The sun poured through the kitchen. I opened the back door and let the air in. Robert came by later, unannounced, with a basket of fresh peaches and a warm loaf of bread from the bakery near the river. He didn't knock, just pushed open the screen door and smiled. "You're glowing," he said. I laughed. "Must be the dirt under my nails." He sat with me on the porch. No questions, no digging. Just two old friends, sharing silence and peach slices and a view of the yard that hadn't looked this alive in years. Later that week, I dropped off a donation at the community center. Extra coats, old puzzles, framed artwork I no longer needed, to hang to remember. The director asked if I'd consider volunteering. They needed someone to help lead the memoir writing group on Wednesdays. "I don't have credentials," I said. She smiled. "You have a story." I said I'd think about it, but I already knew. I walked home with the sun behind me, the path casting soft shadows across my shoes. The tulips nodded in the breeze. A new seedling had pushed through in the herb bed. And I felt something I hadn't in a very long time. Whole. Not because I got justice, not because they said sorry, but because I didn't disappear when they tried to move me. I stayed, and I changed the locks, and I opened the windows, and I kept breathing. The greatest revenge was never about punishment. It was about choosing peace in a house built for me and refusing to let anyone else decide what love should look like, not anymore.